Hello! As part of my year-end wrap-up, I've decided to do a little video on all the books I read last year and what I thought about them, whether I'd recommend them or not. Seemed like a fun thing to do and something that wouldn't take too much effort. These are going to be in chronological order, in the order that I read them. Um, I figured this out. I have a diary where I keep track of not just kind of what happened in the day, but like what media I consumed. So it's not perfect, like I don't write in it every day and sometimes I forget that I've read something that day. But I figured, like, while I was reading a book, there would probably at least be one day that I got it recorded. Anyways, at the start of the year, first thing I read was some Dave Barry books. I know I read this one, but I think I read two or three other ones too, because they're all fairly short. Dave Barry is a comedy writer. He has a newspaper column that he just kind of does comic observations, and then he also does longer form essays sometimes. And I think he's really good. Like a lot of comedy from the era that he wrote in, like the early '90s and stuff, it hasn't aged well. Like it's either really irrelevant or in retrospect, like kind of mean or insensitive. But he's really good in that his comedy like punches up for the most part, and it's taking down kind of like institutions and systems and pointing out just how silly they are, or kind of just looking self-critically at some aspect of his life as sort of an upper middle class um, white American and going like, oh my gosh, is this really the sort of thing that my peer group gets all worked up about? He has a lot of kind of like adventure type stories where him and his friends go out and attempt some sort of popular activity. Like there's some really hilarious ones where they try to go boating and like a million things go wrong. It's all very fun. And then he has these like his longer form essays are more kind of outsidery, but you can see there like the real empathetic core of them, and that they're really like my favorite one is a long essay he did on fans of Elvis. And at first, it seems like he's just kind of make fun of them. Like, oh my God, look at how into Elvis these people are. Look at how much their lives are revolving around this pop star that's been dead for like decades and decades. And there's like a bit of that, but then he really actually gets into, why are they like this? What does Elvis actually mean to them? Isn't that actually not so different than really significant things in your life? It's beautiful. It's honestly really beautiful. There's another one about like UFO spotters and stuff. That's like a similar type of empathetic look. Yeah, I think and I think it's like genuinely funny too. I mean, comedy is like very individual and subjective. So if you don't find it funny, it's probably not worth reading just for like his insights. But I think if you do find it funny, he's a pretty reliable source. So yeah, I was just reading these because I think at the end of last year I had read something big and I wanted something light and fun. After that, I read some Zizek. This is a good one. It's not that long, and unlike a lot of his work, it's fairly focused. He doesn't go off on like 5 million tangents. He only goes off on like maybe a million tangents or so. If you don't know Zizek, he's a philosopher. He's best known for his movies A Pervert's Guide to the Cinema and A Pervert's Guide to Ideology, where he takes big Hollywood blockbusters and breaks down really in depth and really fascinatingly like the ideological messages behind it, like what it's trying to convince you of about the world. And here it's like a little more general, typically. The title comes from this phrase that Marx said. He said, history repeats itself twice. First as tragedy, then as farce. And Zizek basically breaks down a lot of recent events in this pattern. So the big one is 9/11 is the tragic event. And then the massive housing inflation bubble and popping that and the gigantic recession that followed is like the farce. And he kind of talks about how there's these like recurring echoes. I don't know. It's fascinating, but I don't think I can like summarize it very well. But that was good. And then I started reading this one. I haven't finished it yet. I finished the first big chunk, and then I decided I would take a break. And then I read some other stuff, and then I read the second big chunk. But I still have like another two big chunks I think left. This one is a lot more open-ended and wild. Whereas this one was all trying to work back to this title, trying to find this pattern throughout history, tragedy than farce. This one is more anything that makes Zizek think that this is the end times. Anything that's like going crazy, he wants to talk about here. So very broad, wide-reaching topics. Some of them are like really, really fascinating. Uh, the one where he talks about people's fascination with nature videos and how nature is a self-excluding paradise where like the anxieties and the existential questions of humanity about what we should be doing, about what's right, is all like irrelevant to animals. If you watch animals, animals are doing what they're supposed to do like all the time. I don't know. It's like really, I can't really summarize the fascinating part of him talking about it, but it's just really interesting. And then other topics, either because it's about some historical event that I don't really know about, like he talks a lot about like European politics. I don't know too much about that. Some of the other ones I'm just like, I don't know what this means. Like I don't get what you're trying to prove to me, but it's worth getting through those for like the really juicy, insightful parts. So this one's good. It's huge though. Like I said, I still haven't finished it. Just been kind of working my way through it, but it's kind of whenever I just feel like some Zizek, I can just go read a bit of it. Then I read Ulysses. This is the only like major novel I read this year. And I read it for a really, really stupid reason. So my roommate was playing a visual novel from like the 80s or something. He's big into like retro visual novels. And there is a reference in it. And I don't remember why I saw it, but I was like, oh, that's a Ulysses reference. You should read Ulysses. And he's like, I don't know. Why would I do that? And then for some reason, even though there's all sorts of reasons for someone not to read this gigantic, dense, sometimes very difficult to read Irish novel, I was like, no, you should read it. I will pay you $40 if you read it before the end of this school term. And this was like back in February or something. And I was like gung ho about it, and he was like, sure, I'll do it. Yeah. And he felt kind of confident for a bit until he started reading it. And I went as so far as to, I was gonna like give him quizzes about each chapter. Um, Maybe I can find the quiz. Anyway, it's not worth it. So I made a quiz about the first chapter. He didn't get even as far as the end of the first chapter, but whatever. And then I ended up just reading it myself because I think I was just looking for an excuse to reread it anyways. I think this is my fourth complete reread. And again, just fantastic. Just I like it more every time. I already made a long rambling video earlier this year about how much I liked it. I think if you search Ulysses or Bloomsday special on this channel, you'll find it. I think I talk about my 5 favorite chapters or whatever, but I don't know. It's hard to summarize quickly what's so amazing about this novel. Um, I guess it's like, if I can put it in terms that might sound really pretentious, if you have a conception of literature, and here we'll use what I call the promissory definition of literature, which is literary texts are ones that will always reward you no matter how much effort you put into studying it. You're always going to get rewarded with more meaning and more insight. If Okay, so if you believe in such a thing, and you have this conception of literature that you can just think about endlessly and just pore over and study and read books about and stuff, I think Ulysses is the most fun thing in that category. It's like the most wild, funny, silly, uh, genuinely moving, and also like laugh out loud funny book in this category of like hyperdense literature. Um, I don't know. I don't know. It's just such a joy. Like when you this is gonna sound so crazy, but like when you read it, you feel like genuinely happy that the world has advanced to such a state that someone could write something like this. It feels like all of human culture and society and human innovation have been like justified by this. Like, all right, whatever. We should just move on. It's so good though. Uh, Probably just because I've read this more recently than the other books that I sometimes consider my favorite, but this has to be my favorite book. This has to be okay. Then I read more Zizek. I read this little compilation, which is really nice. And if you want a good taste of Zizek, and you don't necessarily want to bite down on one of his really big books or one of his movies, I recommend this because it touches on a lot of different subjects. All it is he tells a lot of jokes in his books because he's really interested in the idea of like when you tell a joke, there's the subject matter of the joke, but it's more like the structure of the joke that allows for like the surprise or the twist that makes the joke funny. So he likes like separating that structure from the subject material and then thinking about like historical events or kind of cultural practices that actually fit into the same template. He loves doing that. So this compilation is just the part where he comes up with these jokes and tells them to you, and they're often hilarious. And the way he tells them is hilarious. Don't worry about this little subheading here. It's not really that much about Hegel. I mean, he loves Hegel, so he's going to talk about Hegel a bit, but they're not jokes like that. They're like very accessible jokes. They're usually very like vulgar jokes. They're not like reference pun jokes or whatever. But yeah, it's cool. It's fun. Good intro to Zizek, I think. Ooh, then I read this. This was really interesting. This was recommended to me by my roommate. I'm not sure who recommended it to him or how he heard about it, but he said it was really super interesting and that I should really check it out. So I did. I'm really glad I did. It's about how decision making works in the brain and how basically you have two major engines in your brain. There's the one part that thinks slowly, and this is sort of like your internal monologue, and it's when you're trying to work your way to a choice and you're like articulating to yourself arguments and trying to logically deduce or whatever what you're going to do. And then there's like the fast thinking brain, and that's all based on like association and recognition. It's the stuff that it's kind of like there right before you even notice, like the things that you don't think about thinking about, but they're just there immediately. And what this book argues is that even though you might think most of your decision making is done with the slow system, that you're able to explain and work out why you're doing what you're doing, in fact, the vast majority of your judgment is happening automatically before you realize it by the fast system, and that the fast system sucks at a lot of things, like a lot of kind of more recent human inventions and such, we're not actually able to deal with at all in this intuitive, fast way. So most of the book is summarizing studies and stuff that illustrate these various deficiencies in the fast brain. And they're all like super surprising and funny and like a perfect little anecdote sized chunk. So that once you read this book, you actually have like conversation topics for years to come. That as soon as you don't know what to say to somebody, you go, "Oh, I read this interesting study recently." Here's a good one, if you want an example. So they were talking about the effect of priming, which is that kind of environmental things, like random things you hear. It doesn't really matter where it comes from, but it can set your mind into this mode that will affect how you answer questions. So they had people spin a wheel, and the wheel stopped on seemingly a random digit, but they rigged it up so it would only stop on like 30 and 60 or something. But whatever, that doesn't really matter. And then they asked the person, "How tall do you think the average redwood tree is?" So the way most people go about answering these sorts of questions is they kind of come up with a number somehow, and then they just kind of like adjust from there, right? And usually this is a fairly safe strategy. That if somebody asked you, is the average height of a giant redwood more or less than 60 feet, you would probably assume that the actual height was somewhere around 60 feet, like the contextual clue you would think would help. And this hunger for any sort of contextual clue is something that's happening in this really fast associative brain. And then it just sort of like suggests you a number, and then you use your slower system to analyze that number and kind of adjust up and down based on how you're feeling about it. But the people would answer based on the random number they spun. If they hit 60, they were much more likely to say a number around 60. And if they hit 30, they were much more likely to say a number around 30. Now, they know that number is random. Rationally, you know that that number has nothing to do with the average height of a redwood. But at the same time, you can't stop your brain from just suggesting this recent number that it heard as if it was somehow helpful. Which, again, if you think about like way back evolutionarily, this sort of like random, arbitrary, meaningless information doesn't really exist. So probably any contextual clues you pick up are actually helpful. So this part of the brain, it's like doing its best, but it throws you like way off. So yeah, I don't know. There's just tons and tons of little stories like this, told in nice, robust ways. Of course, they actually give you the statistics and stuff. Um, and then I thought this was funny too. They kind of suggest how this can be contextualized into like an office business environment, and like times you can like look out for this error occurring in common business transactions, and even like suggests phrases you can use. And I was like, this is so silly. What kind of nerd would do that? But it was before I got a job. And now that I have a job, I've done that like several times. I would bring up like anecdotes from this book in context and be like, well, it's right after lunch, and studies have shown that people have much less like willpower and are much more willing to accept solutions and suggestions if they've just eaten. Ha ha ha. At any rate, the other side of the book, which I think is even more interesting, is they use these studies as sort of a jumping off point to talk about like the greater mysteries of consciousness. So like what is actually happening in the brain in either system, like how is it transmitting observations into data, how is it chunking things, how is it organizing things. That sort of thing I find very, very fascinating, and it reminded me a lot of another book that I read 2 years ago, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, by Julian Jaynes, I think his name is. And he suggests a very, very controversial, very crazy seeming at first, but kind of convincing in some ways, theory about the origin of consciousness. But, that aside, he begins the book with this really thorough breakdown of what consciousness is, what's happening in it, what we can attribute to it, how it arrives at certain things that I find like really fascinating and interesting, and also like really accurate. Like I kept going like, yeah, that is how it works. That must be how it works. Anyways, and then I found that their description of consciousness and stuff too really like lined up with it. So part of me was like, ooh, maybe this makes the theory more likely. But that aside, like if you find those parts of this book interesting, I would really recommend that book. Even if you're never convinced about his crazy, crazy theory, which I don't even want to get into yet, because it would take a long time to explain. At any rate, yeah, very, very cool book. Highly recommended to really anyone. It's an easy read. Like it's never overwhelming or dry or anything. It's always like funny too, because you're just like, oh, you stupid brain. Okay. Then I read some light novels. Well, I read Bakemonogatari. I think part 1, 2, and 3. Are there 3 parts to the first one? Or at any rate, I read all the way up to the end of Bakemonogatari. I read all the way to Tsubasa Cat. Yeah. This is the first time I read light novels. And I mainly did it just because I'm a big fan of the Monogatari anime. And I thought it would be fun. And it was fun. It was a lot of fun. It's like very different than non-light novel writing. It's like really punchy and descriptive heavy and light. Um, it's really hard to describe. And I tried for a while writing in this mode. I tried to write like a light novel. I had a plot that I thought would be really cool, but it was hard. It was hard to hit that line where it's like genuinely exciting and immersive, and yet it has to have this like kind of like snappiness to it, where you're imagining that your reader has an attention span of like 30 seconds. So I don't know. It was difficult, but the books were fun. They were really funny. It was interesting to kind of remember the animated scenes and think about how they animated certain descriptions and stuff. There were certain parts that were cut out of the anime, so that was interesting too. Um, I think it really reveals how in this series, like sort of like Zizek, I guess, it's the keys of the stories aren't necessarily from the characters or the topics of discussion or what the actual supernatural element is, but more of like the structure of the twist, like what element is twisted and what kind of pattern of thought turns out to be incomplete or inconsistent or whatever. I think that's cool. I think that somehow is key to kind of the snappiness of it, that you're always kind of aiming for this one. I don't know. This is really hard to explain. Anyways, yeah, I had a really good time. I'm probably gonna read the rest of the Monogatari series light novels. Um, I don't know if I'll read any others. I kind of want to read Haruhi, but it's hard to track down the physical releases in English, so I'll have to pirate it somewhere, I guess. Then I read this. This is not the actual cover because it's a web novel. It's called Unsung, and it's by a guy named Scott something. Scott Alexander? Is that his name? And he has a blog called Star Slate Codex, which I have a few friends that are big fans of, and I think they read everything. But then sometimes they'll link me articles or they'll post them on Facebook where I can see them. So I read some of his stuff, and I like it, and I like the way he writes, and I like the way he argues. I just haven't been so. I just haven't had the time to like look through any of it, all of it. At any rate, so my friend recommended that I read this web novel that he wrote, and I loved it. It was actually a lot of fun. Um, it's not. I don't think it's like great writing in the sense that I was really convinced the characters were like alive and that I really like cared about them, or that I felt like we were getting some deep insights into humanity or anything. But the premise is really fun. So the premise is that God is real, and the Old Testament of the Bible is like very literal and real, and that there's these names of God that have supernatural properties, all kind of based on things that God actually does in the Bible, I think. That if you manage to discover these secret names of God and say them out loud, you get whatever superpower temporarily. Um, and then there's like angels and stuff, and there's no space, but instead it's just like a firmament, and the devil is real, and it's crazy, and it goes to the full logical extent of this craziness. So, for example, they have camps of people that it's a profession that you just grind through every possible name of God because they just want to discover more of them. So you're just saying every permutation of all of the syllables that could be contained within it. Like that sort of usually series really blunder with this, I think, where they have some sort of supernatural element and then they try to mesh that with like modern society as we know it, and it just doesn't seem realistic. Like it doesn't seem like that's the actual way that modern capitalism and such would wield that power. But this one felt real, which is like that alone is so fresh and so compelling that I think it's worth it for that. It's pretty funny at times. It has a lot of really silly biblical puns. Um, some of which have like such plot significance that you're just I don't know. You're like, could this even be called a twist when it was just like ridiculous wordplay that was hinted at like 12 chapters ago, and lots of like little kind of like puzzle writing, which I like. Um, A lot of the dialogues and stuff are fun, even though I wasn't like completely sold on the characters. I think he did a good job writing like fun, punchy dialogue. It's never just kind of like, here's a bunch of information, blah, 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 blah. Okay, here's my side of the story, blah, blah, blah. Like you can tell, there's a lot of times where I think with a really premise-driven novel like this, you can be lazy and just kind of rest on the fact that your audience wants to know what's going on and not actually make it fun beyond that, which is the other thing I don't really like about genre fiction, or any other kind of fiction story that's based around finding out what happens. That you can't make it just about that. Like you have to make it compelling in and of itself. Anyways, yeah, good. I would recommend it. It doesn't take too long to read. It's a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to seeing if he writes any other novels. I think like the things that I didn't like about it are things that you just kind of have to grind with writing. They're things that you can't do right off the bat. I think you have to spend a long time before you can make characters that feel alive. Then I read this, The Temporary Autonomous Zone. This is a manifesto, I guess, by this anarchist guy who his kind of thesis, as best I can summarize it, is oh, we're screwed. We can't really ever have a proper anarchist revolution. We can't ever overthrow society. The best we can hope for is to live in a temporary autonomous zone. So we would just seclude ourselves from society and have this little anarchist utopia. And it's not going to last forever, and we acknowledge that. And we don't really do things in a way to make them indefinitely sustainable. Like if we need to steal, if we need to be hypocritical, if we need to do this or that or whatever, it doesn't really matter as long as we can just kind of enjoy ourselves for our lifetime. It's pretty, I don't know, this mixture of intense localized hope that something beautiful like this could exist and how wonderful that would be, mixed with the absolutely hopeless cynicism about every other element of society, that it's just no good, no good, and you can never fix it. So why even bother? Just get the hell out of there. It's very compelling to me. I actually can really relate to that. I'm a very pessimistic, cynical person when it comes to society at large. So I don't know. And I like this idea of kind of artistic revolution. And he talks a lot about poetic terrorism, as you can see on the cover here, which is his kind of idea of radicalizing people and basically kind of recruiting them, by like defacing advertising and doing like weird performance art and basically trying to show people that there's so much more to like sensory experience than to just living, and that all of their kind of like long-term planning and societal obligations and stuff are stupid. Yeah, so it's really cool. One thing I should note that's very strange about it is he seems to have like a fascination, like a sexual fascination with young boys, which kind of bleeds through in when he talks about kind of his fantasies about what this zone could look like. And I'm not down with that. I'm not down with pedophilia. Um, and probably none of you are too, but I would encourage you to think of it as just, you can substitute it in with, excuse me, a car just honked. I'm trying to really word this very carefully. Um, it's like, it's just representational of what he sees as limitless paradise freedom, kind of. And you can substitute it with whatever you want to. And he's just saying, like, consequences be damned, you know? I don't know. I don't know if I can word this in a way that's sympathetic, because it's not really about sympathy. It's more just about, I guess, like intensity or whatever. Because don't get me wrong, I don't really agree with his thesis or anything. I think maybe his reasoning about society is compelling to me, but I don't necessarily agree with his thesis. But I think that seeing the passion he has for the thesis and the intensity with which he believes this is our only hope is really compelling and interesting. And he also breaks down a lot of, he talks about like pirate utopias. He talks about other societal like communes and stuff, things throughout history that sort of replicate the model that he's proposing. So that's really interesting too. It seems very thoroughly researched and stuff. Anyways, yeah, very cool, very unique book. I've never read anything like this before, so I just really wanted to warn you about the strange uh, fascination that kind of emerges, so that you're not reading this and you're like, what the fuck is wrong with Steven? No, 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 no. Okay, then I read this. This is Cool AD's novel. He is of the band Das Racist and has done a lot of solo projects. He's a rapper. His book is pretty much like his rapping. It's mostly just kind of descriptions of what he's doing and how cool it is, and what drugs he's taking, what beers he's drinking, what music he's listening to. My cousin, who is not a fan of it, said it was just a list of empty cultural signifiers, but I don't think it's. I think there's something more to it there. What I think he's doing is really trying to cultivate a sense of mood, trying to cultivate an atmosphere and an environment um, through all of these kind of means, in which he does these really vivid, lucid, almost hallucinatory descriptions of kind of fantastic things happening, animals talking to him, or flying around on a magic spaceship with his daughters, looking at crazy stuff, or just like wandering in nature, and how he sees it, and it almost gets to this point of kind of overwhelming description where he's just kind of like iterating on images and themes with this poetic language that I can only really call Joycean. And I think that's his intent, because he often calls himself rap game James Joyce in his lyrics and stuff. So it's like, yeah, okay, all right, I see you here, I see you. So it's not the most like deep, mind blowing thing ever, but it's all right. And then there's like some of the crazy stuff too. Like near the end, there's this long section that's just part of Dante's Inferno, but in here. But then it leads to a section where he goes to the underworld, and that's like really crazy and stuff. And he's talking about like, I get into this fight and I beat him until he's dead, but then he just gets up again because this is the underworld and he's already dead. But then I beat him again and then he was real dead, dead. I don't know. Stuff like that is funny. Then I read this. This is a novella, Party in the USA. This is a friend of mine, Stephen Yee. He wrote it about a trip we took together to Chicago, where we met up with people from the forum Bamani Sos, which is a private tracker about rhythm action game piracy. So he shot a movie first, and then he like novelized the movie. I enjoyed reading this. It was very nostalgic because like I was there. He writes in like the kind of traditional mumblecore style of book, where you're, or alt-lit, it was also called that, but I think alt-lit as a name has been tainted many times for many reasons. I don't know what else to call it. I guess it's sort of like mumblecore. You're basically just describing very blankly everything that's happening, and there's nothing like really fantastical or supernatural happening, but it's the level of blankness and thoroughness in the description that kind of leads you into this almost like trance-like state. So if I was to describe what I was doing right now in normal literature, it might just be like, Stephen was making videos and it was fun. Something. Yeah, aren't I supposed to be a writer? Is that the best I got? But then in alt-lit, it would be like, Steven sat in his, and then it would be like the brand of this chair in front of his DAS keyboard, which, although he found it a little more heavy than his previous keyboard, was overall more enjoyable, although he suspected that perhaps he had paid extra for the LED lighting within the keys, which he never planned on using. the 720p Logitech webcam recorded him as he made videos on a variety of topics, and then you would like list out every topic that I was making videos on. It's that sort of like just kind of empty thoroughness where none of this really means anything, but it's just slowly accumulating in a complete environmental emotional picture. Anyway, so I think he does a good job of that. So I enjoyed reading it on that level. But I found, beyond the nostalgia, I got this like weird anxious feeling when I was like reading about stuff that I was doing and knowing that it was me. I don't know why. And then I was rereading one of my books recently, I think a little after I finished this, that I had written around the time that this book is set. And I felt like the same anxiety and the same unease of like, I don't want to associate with this version of me, I guess. I don't know. I don't know. It was weird. It was strange. But that's not a knock against the book. Check out the book. I don't know. Look for it on Amazon. Then I started reading this. I only read the first three. Yeah, I read the first three stories before the year ended. And now I've read 2 or 3 more. This is a collection of stories by Japanese authors that have survived the Nagasaki and Hiroshima atomic bombings at the end of World War II. Most of the authors like were there when it happened, and a lot of the stories are just direct, horrifying, first-hand accounts of the aftermath, what the survivors were doing, what they did. Really on the level of visceral details about what was happening to people's bodies and stuff. It's just horrific. And these are kind of balanced with stories of people who weren't directly there, but now we're talking about kind of like the cultural and societal fallouts. Like maybe they know people that were involved directly. Maybe they go to the sites afterwards and are kind of just looking at the destruction from an outsider's perspective. Yeah. And they all kind of have these major poetic images that persist through it. Like the crazy iris is one of them, that he's talking about this iris that bloomed out of season. And they refer to it as a crazy iris. And it's sort of an allegory for the bomb, that it was so out of expectation, so beyond the imaginable, the damage that it could cause, that it's this crazy iris of the crazy era. The third story, especially The Land of Heart's Desire. If you just want to read one story, I recommend this one. It is so I don't even know how to describe it. It's one of the most uniquely beautiful short stories I've ever read. I really highly recommend it. It's haunting. It really has the full kind of finality of death within it. The author committed suicide pretty soon after he wrote it, and like you can tell, it really feels like a suicide note. Okay, wow, what a fun way to end this video. Those were the books I read last year. What? Why can't I scroll through them? Only 13. That's not very many. Well, there might have been a couple more Dave Barry books. I was going through those pretty fast. Yeah, that's not that many. I think mostly because this year I started really studying Japanese. Like really kind of taking it seriously. And as a result, the times where I'm normally reading, like on the toilet or on the bus or before bed, instead I was just grinding kanji like all the time. So yeah, book reading way down this year from last year. Last year too, I spent a big chunk of the year as a NEET though, so that's not really fair. I don't know. I think it's worth it though, because eventually, potentially, if I could get enough of Japanese, then I could be reading this. Oops, I could be reading this in the original. Oh my god, that's crazy! I could read all the Oe books. I got to read more of him. I have a friend who's really into him. I could read those in the original too. So I think it's worth in the long run. But yeah, only 13 books, and only one like long book. Only this was long. I don't know. Don't know what I'm gonna read next year yet. Let me know if you have any suggestions. Alright, that's all. Bye bye.